Hey there folks, welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. Before we start, just want to let you know that my first ever full-length fantasy novel titled To Kill a Dragon, now available on Amazon. So if you want to go take a look, maybe pick up a copy, drop a review. After all, if I'm dishing out, gotta be able to take it too. I'd be incredibly grateful. But now on to the matter at hand, the newest album from Joanna Newsom, titled Divers. Have to admit, I've been hesitant to talk about this album. Hell, I've been hesitant to cover Joanna Newsom in general, who I knew more by reputation than anything else before I started doing my deep research for this review. I knew she had one of the most idiosyncratic voices in folk music, a bit like a cross between Bjork and Sia, but a little bit more rounded and warm. But I knew she had amassed a lot of critical acclaim for her vibrantly detailed, excellently witty songwriting that probably runs as close to twee as I would ever tolerate, except for the fact that she also happens to be an incredibly gifted composer, utilizing her harp and piano and a lot of gorgeously rich instrumentation to compose layered, polyrhythmic songs drenched in English and Celtic folk. Now, the majority of that right up my alley. And thus when I started listening through the Milk-Eyed Mender, I found a lot that I really liked, even despite a few minor missteps when it came to instrumental tones that kind of clashed with Newsom's unique vocals. Then came Yeez. And on the one hand, I liked the more opulent orchestration for how well it could mesh the dramatic swell of the writing in Newsom's more strident tones, but there was a part of me that kind of missed the quieter, funnier witticisms that ran through her more stripped-back material. The album started to pick up the feeling of meandering pastoral indulgence, focusing more on the intricate details of the story rather than the overarching whole, which seemed to reach critical mass on the triple album Have One On Me that she released in 2010. And you know what, here's the thing. Yes, over 2 hours of music, that can be really long, but it's one of those releases that really works better considering each disc is an individual release with its own musical motifs and underlying themes. And really, they don't feel as long as you might think, especially when you're poring over the lyrics at the same time. It's really a great poetic exercise. That said, I do understand why some can think that quieter second disc can kind of drag a bit, especially with comparison with the more elaborate instrumentation of that first disc and the slightly brighter tones of the third. And when I heard that Joanna Newsom was pursuing even more elaborate, layered instrumentation on our newest album this year, 5 years after Have One On Me, well, I was interested. At the very least, it would probably sound beautiful and be a rewarding dive into some really good poetry. So I dove into Divers. What'd I find? Well, it's a fascinatingly cerebral listen, but I expected that. Joanna Newsom took 5 years to write this elliptical album about how we view and understand the passage of time. Of course, it's gonna take its classically overwritten style very seriously and require a lot of listens to decode. That's why this album review is kind of late. It's certainly our most melancholic and statuesque record, with the grandest textures and most ambitious themes, with some of our most fantastical stories to date, and yet, for as much as I want this album to reach the pinnacle as one of the best of the year, it just misses that emotional moment of transcendence with me. Still a damn great record that's gorgeously composed, beautifully textured, and excellently written, but I feel it was on the cusp of a real great revelation and didn't quite break free for me. Ironic given the themes and nature of the album, but we'll get to that. Now to begin, let's talk about Joanna Newsom herself, and I'll say it, her voice is easily the most accessible that it's ever been. Speaking as someone who hasn't always loved the more eccentric elements in her tone, there's a liquid yet fluttering smoothness to her voice that I really like. Where things start to go slightly awry though is in the vocal production, both in the multi-tracking and some of the vocal filters. First, the multi-tracking. I have to admit, it was a little bit jarring when I heard on the final minute of Waltz of the 101st Lightborne, mostly because Newsom's tone is so strident, it didn't really need it, but you know what, her voice did grow on me, especially on songs like Sapokanakan and the choral vocals on the first half of Time as a Symptom. What didn't really grow on me were some of the filters that made her voice feel a little bit more lo-fi and compressed, like on Things That I Say, or the traditional folk song Same Old Man, the one song she didn't write on this album. Yes, I get why they were used, in order to evoke a more older, earthier vibe, but especially on Same Old Man, they felt like they hemmed her voice in unnecessarily, and it did feel a little bit distracting to me. Now, some of you are probably wondering if it was a similar case for the broader instrumental selection that Newsom brought to the table. And while I'd like to say she put together a breathlessly gorgeous symphonic tapestry that's impervious to criticism, yeah, not quite. Now, don't get me wrong, the foundational melodies on the harp and especially the piano are goddamn gorgeous, and her knack for melodic transitions and time signature and tempo on songs like Waltz of the 101st Lightborne is stunning. And elements like the swell of cellos and strings on Anecdotes, the darker, more spacious tones on You Will Not Take My Heart Away, or that faded clipping out saw on The Things I Saw. The last is a song that's practically an interlude for Newsom, but it sounds fantastic. It marries the grounded elegance with the ethereal in stunning fashion. And even the instrumental touches that are a little bit more ornamental, like the harpsichord or the zither, they still manage to work in adding that quivering delicacy that really works for Newsom's tones. Of course, the instrumental element that got me me the most excited was the return of the country elements on Goose Eggs. I thought that Newsom had a really unique touch with country tones on her debut, and she nails it here. I really loved it. But there are two instrumental choices I have to question. The first is the horns and the recorder. On tracks like Sepulchanican and Time as a Symptom, they can feel a little bit garish and overstated, not quite as fitting with the rest of the song as deeply as they could. The rest, more immediately jarring, is the mellotrons. Most immediately noticeable on Leaving the City in the most blaring form, I felt the best usage of them was when they were a little bit more subtle, like in the traditional Focus Same Old Man for a supple foundation. Shame the rest of the song didn't rise to more, but again, the mellotrons, this felt a little bit out of place, a little bit too synthetic to really blend all that well. But then again, if you listen closely to these songs, you'll start to see instrumental and lyrical motifs mirrored across this album, with the piano ballad of The Things I Say operating as the folding point, which, of course, Joanna Newsom intended, which is why the song is loaded to references with The Road Not Taken, Making Choices. And I'll definitely give her credit for the meticulous construction on the symmetry, the country elements on Goose Eggs and Same Old Man, the spacious, creeping chill of death on Leaving the City echoed on You Will Not Take My Heart Alive, the contemplation of one's legacy when falling out of a plane on Sepulchanican and a pinlight bent, and most starkly of all, the Morning Dove Call the Birds in the lyrics of Anecdotes and Time as a Symptom, with the final word of the closing track matching up with the first word of the first track, closing that loop. So what I mean when I say that's an elliptical album structure, and you can trace it either backwards or forwards. Remember that. But that's, you know what, that's cleverness and construction. What is this album actually about? Well, once you untangle the web of pastoral imagery and storytelling, with the running motif of descending towards death spanning the entire album either through falling or diving, it first seems the question of what is more painful, to be born or to die. Now, it's generally accepted by most of human culture that it's death, which is why so much of this album focuses on that encroaching ending, and the possibility that everything we might say or do in our lives, any of our legacy, might be eradicated or forgotten or painted over by time's steady march. Which is why Joanna Newsom injects this record with a hefty load of physics imagery and time travel to subvert traditional expectations. And speaking as someone who has a degree in physics, Newsom gets the broad strokes of the concepts well enough as she needs to on like a pinlight bent, and especially on that pulpy sci-fi story of Waltz of the 101st Lightborne, which I absolutely loved, which shows a legion going back in time to try to recapture the past after her world was ravaged by war after war, only to slip back forwards towards death because you can't recapture that nostalgia properly. And on its counterpart on Divers, it's not so much about going back to that primordial darkness in the deep. You're still stuck in the same loop, you're still going towards death, you're not getting away. But really, if I'm thinking about it, the album isn't that cosmic. And the first major clue is given on The Things I Say, contemplating possibilities, what might have been, choices. Now think back to the ellipse of this album, two paths, forwards and backwards, towards birth and death. Newsom makes it very clear that death is considered more painful because it is the end that overshadows the rest. But if time were to flow both ways, or flow backward, wouldn't birth have its own unique pain overshadowing death if time flowed in that direction? The larger point is that time as itself has endpoints. It is finite. And as Newsom states outright, love is not a symptom of time, time is just a symptom of love. We need to make a choice to find love and not expect time to drag us to it. We're the ones who can use that pinhole, the tiniest of choices, to bend the light into the amor obscura. Nice Latin there, Joanna. And while it might be finite in its own projected course, we need to be able to accept that and cherish the love that it provides, all the more value for it for its finite nature. So yeah, okay, maybe the album is that cosmic, but it begins together that human element that makes it feel approachable, especially in the instrumentation. Hell, I normally expect these sort of themes to show up in progressive rock or progressive metal, not here, but it works. And you can bet I admire the hell out of what Joanna Newsom did in the construction and the meticulous arrangements of this album. Even if I do argue it's just a shade shy of completely getting there all the way for me. And you know what, that's the frustrating thing. Divers is a deep, incredibly well thrown out and well written album, but beyond a few stellar songs, it doesn't quite reach most of its instrumental potential. A few elements have been tuned a little bit tighter, the textures and sounds blend together a little bit stronger. I'd say this is her best album and one of the best of the year. But as it is for me, it's an extremely strong 8 out of 10 and a high recommendation, particularly if you're looking for a poetic record to really dig into and deconstruct. But you know what, even if you're not, folks, you're not gonna get many albums that sound this gorgeous this year. Definitely check this out. You will not regret it. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I may be even grateful. Yeah, this album review got a little bit cerebral, but this is one of these albums that I'm really curious what your interpretations of the lyrics are, because this is one of those deep ones. I'm guaranteed that I probably went off in a couple different directions. I want to see what you guys thought. But if there's any other albums you want me to review, and there's a lot coming up, or if there's anything else that I might be able to do to improve my presentation, I'm all ears. Until then, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse. and I'll see you next time.